time on the 29th of June. But now it's my very pleasant duty to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Philip Jones, Senior Curator and Researcher at the South Australian Museum. Philip studied here history and arts and law degree, specialising eventually in history at Adelaide University, and he was particularly impressed with the work of some of our eminent historians of that time, like Austin Goff and Hugh Stretton. That influenced him to focus on the importance, to understand the importance of archival documents and original, first-hand, primary records to be able to write detailed stories of individual stories of real people, and to use those as the basis for drawing out the larger history. And for all of you who are friends of Lutheran Archives, obviously we endorse that approach very greatly. He was also impressed by the eye for detail, and that surely is something that one can understand was a great asset to him in his work at the museum, and which obviously focuses on objects, art, artifacts, and so on. Alongside his work at the museum, he has published very widely and in of many different aspects of the subject of the people, the contact between peoples here in South Australia. One of his books, a really significant book, Ochre and Rust, Artifacts and Encounters on the Australian Frontier, was awarded a prize, a significant prize, by and really, to my mind, set a trend in writing about writing our history from the point of view of objects and what they can tell us about the broader history. That book, for example, focused on a lump of ochre, or Aboriginal ceremonial shields, or Daisy Bates' travelling suit. Quite a diverse range of things, but he was able to use those to draw out new insights into the broader history. Other books he's written many, have focused on, for example, the Killal Peninatoas, the Muslim Cameleers, the German ethnographers and naturalists here in South Australia, on boomerangs, on Namatjira, on the photos of Paul Felscher in the Northern Territory and other photographers of the interior, on the, and of course, now that he has finished this long, detailed work on George French Angas, he is already working on new publications, one of which is a co-authored book on Aboriginal shields of northeastern Australia, and the other is a history of the Yuendamu Men's Museum. So there is a lot to look forward to in the works that he and the insights he has gathered in that wide range of research over the years. So please welcome Philip Jones.
not. Yeah, yeah, good. I think I'm audible. Yeah, good, very good. Now, the other thing will be this, and I think, is it a matter of calling for the first slide? There we are. So, there is George French Angas, probably painted in 1849 on his return from South Africa. And I included an image of Lord Byron next to him, partly because Angas himself was in the mould of a 19th century romantic. He saw himself in that light. He even adopted similar attire to Byron, and he interspersed his writings with poetic couplets from Byron and Shelley. He really did see himself as leaving the world of commerce behind, which was the world of his father and his mercantilism in London, so that he could pursue, well, as he put it in his own record, if he could shake the dust from his feet and go to the uttermost ends of the earth in pursuit of these ideals. And that's, in one sense, what he did. And so I'm going to take that tack, but then I'm going to take a step back and say, well, no, it really wasn't quite like that. He was gripped by his own passions, but sooner or later he had to come down to earth. So we'll deal with that. So if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to just show you a few images from his youth. He was a precocious young artist. Even at the age of 3 or 4, he was painting pictures on the walls of his bedroom. And they were pictures of natural history. They were not inane doodlings. They were actually grounded in reality, and his own artwork from that early age was always tethered to the real world, descriptive of insects or landscapes. And the next one. At the age of 16 at Tavistock Grammar, which was in Devon, he produced his own little magazine, which was available to subscribers for a penny a month. You then had to pass the magazine on to the next person on the list. That was the way the subscription worked. But this again was something that he pursued with his actual publications. And by the time he reached the volumes that he produced from his Australian and New Zealand excursions, he had more than 500 subscribers at a pretty high level in society. But here you are, you can see what was happening in London in England in 1836 was that his father was receiving information about South Australia and images and even specimens of animals. And the young Angas, who by then was 14, he was born in 1822. So when South Australia was founded, he was 14. He was adding these images to his little magazine. Next one. He was self-taught up until the age of about 15 or 16, although he'd learnt, he had art tuition at school. But then realizing, I think in probably 1837 or 38, when he's approaching 16, realizing that he needed the finer points explained to him, and he began receiving lessons from Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who was one of the foremost watercolourists in London and also a lithographer. So very quickly, George French Angas picked up the craft of chromolithography, which was relatively new at that stage. And this was a skill which he employed very well. And the next one. In 1841, he set off on a solo expedition to Malta and Sicily. He was able to do that because in all these things his father was grudgingly funding him. He really wanted his eldest son to be operating as a clerk in his family business in London, which was a very high level business involving the importation of mahogany from Honduras and a lot of banking. He established, George French Angas established the first bank in Adelaide a little later, and he had been already responsible for really implementing the first regional banking in England. Up until George French Angas's initiative, there were no regional banks. So this was just indicative of the energy and the industry that was behind the Angas name, I suppose, in England. Some of those images were lithographed by George French when he returned from Malta and Sicily. How are we going back there? Is that coming through? Or? No. I'm right. Okay. Well, I'll just persevere. Oh, with the microphone. Okay, that didn't seem to be working, but it is. Yes, I can see. Okay. So A Ramble in Malta and Sicily was the name of the book. He lithographed that title page on the right, but he also produced a prospectus for it, which he circulated. And this prospectus, in a way, was the model for the prospectus which he developed for his major publication that he already was envisaging at the age of 19 in 1841. The idea of coming to South Australia and making a very large, lavish volume with his own artwork. So we will skip to the next one. And this is Angas in South Australia. So what happened is that he arrived in Adelaide on the 1st of January 1844, and within a couple of days he was in the Barossa. But before that, he went to meet George Grey, the governor who had taken over from George Gawler. Gawler had been recalled to England largely because of the economic situation, which had deteriorated significantly. All of this is important for the backstory relating to George French Angas, and we'll return to that. But in the meantime, meeting George Grey was a real breakthrough, because Grey had already shown a great deal of interest in exploration and ethnography. And here was a young man, 21 by that time, George French, and he was all geared up and ready to set out on these expeditions. Gray was still, I suppose you could say, turning the economy around. He'd instituted very strict austerity in Adelaide. The problem was that the crops had failed for several years in a row. This meant that the initial plans for the Adelaide population was that people would come to Adelaide and then gradually move into the country, start farming and bring in income to the colony. But because the crops were failing, this shift to the country hadn't occurred. And Gray had to manage that situation. It turned around partly because the seasons improved, and by 1842, 43, well, certainly by 1844, Gray was feeling the pressure lift, and he was already beginning to think of his primary passion, which was exploration, and beginning to think of where he might go. He knew that he had to get to Port Lincoln, he had to get to the southeast, and he was also keen on exploring the Coorong. So Angas really landed on his feet. He needed, in order to produce the sort of book that he wanted to produce, South Australia Illustrated, he needed to extend his tour well beyond the Barossa and the nearest districts to Adelaide. So later in January in 1844, so really only about 2.5 weeks after he arrived, the opportunity came for a journey to the Lower Murray and the lakes. The South Australia Company had acquired one of the peninsulas that runs into Lake Albert, unbeknownst to the Narrabri people. They found themselves beset by herds of cattle, and yet they were not allowed to touch them. It's a familiar story. And the journey that Angas made with William Giles, who was the manager of the South Australia Company at that time, and also George Mason, who was the police trooper stationed at Wellington, who got on very well with Aboriginal people and actually married into a group of the Narrabri. George Mason became the interpreter for George French, so that all the names and all the sort of intricate detail that Angas collected and linked to his images, a lot of that comes from George Mason. I won't explain each one of those images there, but you can see the one in the middle at the top is actually one of his pages of sketches, and this I think we'll be back in business in a moment. But he used this technique of staffage, which was that you had figures to hand, which would be in a sketchbook or a notebook. You drew a scene and then you inserted those figures because you already had them, and it was a technique that he used over and over again. It was not uncommon. But he managed to incorporate exactly the right figures because he saw the people in their characteristic poses, Aboriginal people, whether they were making fire or cooking or gathering food. And as you can see in the bottom left, those are two of those figures at Lake Albert that he inserted into the picture. They're not on the original sketch, which is in the National Library. So you see the original sketch without the figures, but you see a little space available for those figures to be inserted. Next slide. The second journey, these were all, these journeys, 3 of them occurred between January and May of 1844, and the 4th journey was in February of the following year, when he'd returned from New Zealand, which I'm not going to talk about. That's just a little bit too much detail. But this was the second journey, and this was more of a, this was Gray himself on this journey. Was the opportunity that he'd been waiting for a bit of a holiday, and he and a party of friends and officials hadn't really explored the Fleurieu Peninsula, which is so well known to us today. We tend to think of it as Adelaide's backyard in a way. But all of these places like Carricalinga, which is there in the middle on the lower level, and Second Valley on the right, Rapid Bay, top left, Yatagalinga, which is near Yankalilla on the top right, and then coming down the hill towards Victor Harbour with a bluff in the distance in the middle on the top. And on the left, the whaling station at Encounter Bay, with Aboriginal people making use of the whale bones that had washed up on the beach. Okay, next one. The third journey was in April, May, and this was the largest and the longest journey, with increasing pressure on Gray to do something about the squatters who were coming over from Western Victoria into South Australia without notifying the government and setting up their runs around or near Mount Gambier. Mount Gambier had not been actually plotted on the map. It had been sighted from the sea in 1801, but no English surveyor had actually been there. So this was the opportunity to go down there and fix the positions of these places, such as Mount Shank and Mount Gambier. And they went down along the Coorong. When they reached the vicinity of present-day Beachport, Angas and Gray documented the Australian sea lion, which you can see there sketched on the bottom, and the penguins, which were on an island near Beachport. Yes, a lot to be said about those images, and those are only a sample of the ones recorded on the third journey into the bush. We have the next one, which was the fourth journey the following year to Port Lincoln and to Kangaroo Island. So the image on the bottom right is actually the first settlement in South Australia, which was at Nepean Bay, and had been abandoned, but the houses were still there. And when Gray's ship was turned back on its journey down to Robe, or the present-day locality of Robe, because of the inclement weather, they put into Nepean Bay, and Angus was able to make that sketch before they went on further to Port Lincoln, where, interestingly, in terms of the Lutheran connection, he lent very heavily upon Clamor Schumann, who was the missionary there at Port Lincoln. Angus was his guest, and the material that he recorded about the Aboriginal people of Port Lincoln, the Bangala and the Ngao people, came directly from Schumann, and Angus acknowledged that in his text. So those are that is the sort of beyond part of the talk this evening, and I wanted to now move back to the Barossa. So if we go to the next slide, in between there are some images of natural history, because as well as those expeditions, he had an abiding interest, and you could say it was his main interest really in life, was as a natural historian. Ultimately, and from the beginning as a child, his interest was in conchology, or shells, and he became, he eventually held the largest collection of Southern Hemisphere shells, and there was an auction that took 2 days in the 1870s when he finally sold his collection. The interesting thing about South Australia Illustrated is that it doesn't contain any images of shells, and I haven't been able to find a reason for that, because he certainly collected them, and I suspect the reason was that he still needed to identify them. There were many new specimens, and he couldn't really publish the shells without that identification. But the insects he certainly did, and he had the help of naturalists in Adelaide at that time, including 1 or 2 Germans who had, for example, Hermann Beer, or I don't know if they got the pronunciation right, Behr, was here or living in the Barossa. There was also Marianne Kreuzler, who was a fascinating naturalist living at Buxveld near Gawler. There's no evidence that Angus actually met her, but she was around, and he did acknowledge several of these collectors who were based in Adelaide. One of them was C.D.E. Fortnum, who lived at Norton Summit for a couple of years, and he was a relative of Fortnum and Masons in London, that family. He was quite well off. And we'll have the next one. And of course, the other pursuit was that of ethnography. And Angus really did not have an equal in the area of delineating and describing material culture of Aboriginal people. The colours, the texture, the detail, comparing his works with actual surviving objects from that period. He really he worked within a very tight ambit of accuracy. He didn't stray beyond that. So we continually appreciate his skill in that respect. Yes. Okay, and the next brings us to. I heard somebody say almost with a degree of levity this evening, our benefactor. George French Angas, I think, is still regarded fondly by German descendants in South Australia, and the story of his involvement in South Australia is I'm sure familiar to most of you, and I'm not going to go over it, but there are aspects that are worth repeating. And there are a couple of images there which you probably haven't seen, or one of them I put in the book, but the one on the right has come to light subsequently, and it is a remarkable image because it's a daguerreotype of Angus in 1844. Is that what I've got there? Yeah. And so that's very early for a photograph, and it's the earliest image earliest photograph we have of George French Angas. And whereas you can see on the left that he has well, I mean, that's almost a fictional character, but the one on the right, you can see the hard edge to the man, I think. You can see that he's got some fibre, and that's certainly the way he comes across in his dealings with his two sons, in particular. George French was a constant irritant to his father, I think. On the other hand, John Howard Angas, who was a year younger than George French, and so was only 20 at the time that Angas came to South Australia, George French, was a remarkable fellow, more or less in his father's mould. He had an extraordinary capacity for work, and we see that through the diary that he kept, which has lain sort of fallow for many years, but has now been transcribed. And even though the entries are often just 2 lines for a day, or maybe 3 or 4, what's contained in those entries is just remarkable. The vigour of this young man who's just 20 years old and was sent out by George Fife to essentially save the situation. And the situation was an extraordinary one. George Fife had, you could say, inadvertently bought 3/4 or half of the Barossa Valley. He'd done that because he'd already was in a position to buy land in South Australia, being the chair of the South Australia Company. He had agents here and there. He had several agents in Germany because he was already seeing that the situation in Germany meant that there would be potential migrants to South Australia, and they would have skills that were required, particularly in terms of crafts and farming and labouring. But he also had an agent in South Australia, Charles Flaxman. And Flaxman, as many of you probably know, used the full extent of his license, I suppose, from George Fife, who had empowered him to buy good land if it came up. And I mentioned Gawler earlier. Gawler was the one who had instituted the system of special surveys. The Wakefield scheme was one which was supposed to free up land in small parcels to working families who wanted to come to South Australia. But there was not enough of those parcels of land being sold. And that's partly why the economy had slipped so much. So Gawler reluctantly went ahead with these special surveys, which enabled people of wealth to buy much larger pockets of property. There's still controversy over whether George Fife and George Gawler, I could use the term colluded in the special survey business, and I think the jury's still out on that, but I've certainly seen letters which have not been mentioned by other historians, which indicate that the two of them were exchanging information. George Gawler was extolling the virtues of the Barossa well before George Fife got the bill for the Barossa. Flaxman had taken the opportunity, having gone up there, and the story is, and I believe it is the case, that Mengi had actually discovered the potential of the Barossa. He was the first to realise what lay up there, and to report to George Fife and to yes, well, particularly to George Fife, who was interested, but he'd already let Flaxman know, and Flaxman went ahead and bought the property, bought the 7 special surveys. And those 7 surveys, if we move to the next slide, now I'm not expecting you to to see the detail in this map, but essentially it's the map of the Barossa Valley, and the spread of lines sort of up and down that map are 80-acre sections within those special surveys. I, not really realising how legible that would be, I had put little red numbers on there showing Tarawata, which was the headquarters for John Howard Angas, on the what is now the North Parra River, but was then known as the Gawler River. Angaston, Bethany, Duck Ponds Creek, which eventually became the Shannon holding, but it was where George French Angas made his first pictures in the Barossa. Macolta, which was really at the northwestern extent of the land. Lindock, down in the southeast, and Angus Park, which was then sort of an extent of land, but was also the early term for Nuriutpa. And John Howard Angas, taken in midlife on the left. So you strip away the beard, I think, and think of him as a 20-year-old. So he had essentially the task of managing that property as a 20-year-old. He had to organise the construction of small stations here and there, barns, fences, roads. It really is mind-boggling what he took on and what he succeeded in doing in a more or less unflappable way. He didn't boil over, as you might expect. Right, the next one. Now, of course, this was land that Aboriginal people had lived on and knew intimately, to the extent of having names and stories and explanations for every feature, every hill, every creek, every outcrop of stone. All those features were named and known, and we have almost nothing of that knowledge today. So that point should be made. And until, I would say probably until now, it's been assumed that there's almost no visual record of who those people were in the Barossa. We know that they were probably Nudgeri people, whose country extended further to the north, but probably didn't go east over into the Mallee. So the Mallee was known as the scrub, the Murray scrub at that time. But there is a record, and I didn't put it in the book because I hadn't really processed all the information. But I think my line of reasoning is that Angas recorded two dances, or two, you could say, corroborees in Adelaide in mid or April 1844. And he was able to do that with the assistance of William Cawthorne, who lived in Adelaide, and he was another young man, a school teacher, living in a leaky house near where the Morford Street Bridge is today, with his mother, who was also a school teacher. And Cawthorne became heavily, or Angus became heavily dependent on Cawthorne. You have to remember that Angus, when he stepped off that boat a few weeks earlier, had very little knowledge of the indigenous people of Australia. He was on a very steep learning curve, and Cawthorne was his teacher or tutor, you might say. Angus borrowed artefacts from Cawthorne, which he then worked up and published. And Cawthorne was responsible for bringing Adelaide Plains people to Angus to sketch and draw. I don't think he had a role in actually organising these ceremonies. That would be a bridge too far. But he was able to introduce Angus to some of the key figures. Both Angus and a few other commentators make the point that the Kuri dance, as it was called, was a dance or a ceremony brought down by the northern people. And it took a long time for me to work out who he meant by that. Certainly there were people here in Adelaide in mid-1844 from the River Broughton, and they would be Nukunu people. And I had thought, and I think I put it in the book, that the Kuri dance may well have been by Nukunu people. But now I've come to the conclusion that, in fact, they were from Lindok. They were Barossa people. And the reason for concluding that is that this man on the left, and Angus did draw 4 or 8 actually pictures of people in ceremonial costume. This is a man of the Lindok Valley adorned for the Kuri dance. And that's the original, or an image of the original watercolour that we have in the South Australian Museum, as is the original of the Kuri dance itself. And in that scene, you'll see probably an 8-year-old child dancing, a boy, and the figures in the foreground are women and children observing the ceremony. This sends a very clear message that it was a public ceremony and not a restricted ceremony. And that's important to note. But when you have a close look at that image, you see that the figure in the foreground has the same body decorations as the man of the Lindok Valley. And it makes sense then that he was certainly from the Lindok Valley, and if he was, so were his his fellow dancers. So that's if that is the case, and I believe it is, then this stands as perhaps our most visible and accessible record of who the Barossa people were and what they looked like. Next one. So this brings us to Klemzig. And of course, Angus, when he received the bill for the Barossa Valley, it was £30,000. And in today's money, according to Google, this is now the equivalent of £4 million today. Pounds sterling, if you can still use the term sterling, I don't know. He had to find that money. He didn't have it lying around. He had to liquidate his Newcastle coachworks business and a few other things. And he actually had a breakdown through this period. He had to be put in a sanatorium for a while. He was under enormous pressure to come up with this money. because he tried to get the South Australia Company to buy the 7 special surveys in the first instance, but they wouldn't, and they didn't have the money. So he understood that he had to go through with it, otherwise he'd be in prison. And he managed to do that. But at the same time, he had Pastor Carville come to stay at his house, or come knocking on his door in the first instance, having heard about his sympathy for the old Lutherans. Just as Angas himself was a dissenter, he was a Protestant of a certain colour who believed in the old and simple ways of worship, and the dissenters had been heavily prejudiced against by the Church of England establishment in Britain since the 17th century, when dissenters had been burnt at the stake. So it wasn't so long ago that the English dissenters had been in the same fix that the German dissenters were in at that time. And Angus's sympathy for their plight had meant that Carville had a very hearty welcome in London, and he did actually come and stay with George Fife while they worked out strategies as to how to bring the Germans to South Australia. Once again, Angas had thought that the South Australia Company would recognise the worth of having the German labourers and workforce come to South Australia, and that they might underwrite the ships or the passages of the Germans to Adelaide. But they didn't. They didn't see it that way, and they thought Angas was in a conflict of interest situation, and they didn't want to be part of that. So he had to come up with that money as well. And this influenced, in a way, the way he tackled the problem. And so he paid for the ships, and he paid for the passage of all the Germans on those 4 ships that arrived in late 1838. But they were all bound to repay their passage money and any other money that they'd been advanced. So it wasn't straight out charity, it was a business deal. And eventually, Angas, of course, did extraordinarily well, because he had this number of tenant farmers who were hardworking and immediately dedicated themselves to paying off their debts, some more quickly than others. And this is how George Fife was able to send John Howard Angas to South Australia to ensure that those monies came back to the family, and that the deals that were done with the land held up and were carried forward into the next few years. So initially, all of the Germans from those 4 ships pretty well ended up on Angus's land on the Torrens at Clemsic. It seems very rapid. Within a few months, the village was built and was standing. I've seen a plan of this, because it was really just a single street, and I've seen a plan of it with the names of the pioneers, or the settlers who in each house. It doesn't quite correspond with Angus's drawing, Angus's watercolour, and we need to look into that a bit further, because I think the listing that was done was made a year or 2 later and didn't necessarily correspond to where they were first when they arrived. But if we look at the next slide, we see two if you can discern that. So on the right is the actual sketch. It's in the National Library for that image, and it's pretty well exactly the same. Sometimes Angus made a pencil sketch and then drew the watercolour over the top of it. So you see the pencil outlines underneath the watercolour. In this case, it's a separate image. But in the middle of the street is just a ghostly, you wouldn't be able to see it, but there's a ghostly image of a cart, and then in the watercolour you see that fully realised, a horse and a wagon, really. But more interestingly, perhaps, is the sketch on the left, because this is George French Angas's sketch of Carville's mother. And that's intriguing, because where and when was that done? She did accompany Carville to Adelaide, as I understand. So it could have been made in Adelaide. I just don't know, but it could also have been made in London, because his mother might have come to London as well. It needs a bit more work, but it's indicative of the fact that there was a bond, a rather close relationship between Carville and George French Angas, which endured, actually. Next one. So Clemzig became very full rather quickly, and of course one group then set off for Harndorf and formed the village there. But in 1842, by then, finally, Angus had sorted out the special survey business, and he was about to send John Howard Angus, but he had made land available at Bethany for the Germans, and so a group of mainly Clemzig people came up to Bethany and established the village there. And that's what you see here in 1844, George French's rendition of Bethany with the hills behind, and the Tanunda Creek running through. And it is, I think, very interesting to look at what Angus said about the Germans, because here I think you get the impression that he's certainly sympathetic towards them and sees them as worthy additions to the South Australian immigrant population. But there was a lot of suspicion about the Germans in sort of Adelaide establishment circles, and I've read McLaren, who was one of the principals of the South Australia Company. His opinion of the Germans was that you have to be a bit wary of them. They may not be able to be trusted, and so in South Australia Illustrated, the text that Angus has relating to Clemzig is also of that sort of character. He says of them, they are stout Lutherans, and their chief, can't quite read my writing, but supporter, the Reverend Mr. Carville, a most worthy and indefatigable man, exercises great influence among them. Though frugal and industrious to an extraordinary degree, they are a slow, plodding class, with many conventional prejudices, and frequently exhibited considerable selfishness and ingratitude. I find that interesting, coming from the son of the man who's brought them out here. Their houses and cultivations are in the style of their own country, and living as they do entirely to themselves, amalgamation with the English portion of the settlers is of rare occurrence. So that, there's a lot in there, I think, in terms of the sort of attitudes that probably prevailed in Adelaide establishment circles at that time. But against that, or countering it and balancing it, is the testimony of Angus's brother, John Howard Angas. And once again, it brings me back to that diary, the journal, because his work consisted, he was building the flocks, he was doing what he became famous for later, which was breeding extraordinarily well with getting the merino flocks up to a very high standard very quickly, making money that way. Same with the cattle. Every post became a winning post for him. But his primary obligation to his father in particular was to make sure that the money was coming back from the Germans to reimburse George French Angas and to undertake leases in the Barossa. So all those 80-acre sections that you saw, the extraordinary thing about John Howard Angus's journal is that he names individual Germans and talks about their leases on particular sections. So, I think it would be a fantastic thing to do to deepen that research and to actually link the individual German families with those sections and to sort of track them through time. That would be very interesting. Okay, next one. Really almost on the last leg here, George French came to South Australia and he set off on those 4 expeditions that I've shown you. And you can draw the conclusion that here is this free spirit funded by his wealthy father who steps off the boat and then goes and does what he wants. But in fact, he had an undertaking with his father. His father was in dire trouble financially, and what he needed more than anything else was to very quickly publicise the Barossa Valley and begin selling land. He went on horseback tours through northern England and Scotland in actually the early 1830s, mid-1830s, I should say, and he was looking for something which he could really use to promote South Australia. And this is where I think his project and his son's project to use art as a stepping stone to become a naturalist coincided. So George Fife, despite his money problems, was able to fund George French's journey to South Australia, knowing that his son had this talent and could use that talent to produce works which could in turn publicise South Australia. And so what was needed was for George French to rapidly get on with that work. And he did that knowing that in late February a particular ship was heading back to England, and the idea was that he would send a package of his images on board that ship back to his father, who could then use those images. Quite how he would use them is a bit unclear, and I don't know whether George Fife really knew that, but certainly what he was tapping into was this growing appetite in mid-Victorian England for images. The printing processes had democratized that sort of access to images. widely across the middle classes and even the lower classes. And whether it was in the form of a broadsheet or a pamphlet or something like that, the South Australia Illustrated would happen, but that wouldn't happen for a year or two. So George Fife had another plan, which was to produce what he called a description of the Barossa range. And this did appear, but not until 1849, as it happened, 3 years after, or 2 years after South Australia Illustrated. And when it did appear, it had a little bit like a sort of real estate agent's text, publicising land that was being opened up, and supplemented with George French Angas's watercolours, which were lithographed. So that was published in 1849, and it was published under the name of Agricola. And for many years, it has been, no one's known who Agricola was, and the assumption has been that it was John Howard Angas, because he was here, he knew the Barossa, he would have been the one describing it. But it is now very clear through George Fife Angus's own diary entry that it was George Fife who wrote it. And he had not been to South Australia, but he had numerous letters from his son, John Howard, explaining or describing the Barossa. And he also had this correspondence with George Gawler, who was very keen on the Barossa. So that's what occurred. And these images were among those that George French sent to George Fife, his father, at the end of February 1844. There are 6 in that book, but we know from John Howard Angus's diary that George French made at least 7 or 8 more as well. Their whereabouts is a mystery, and they may come to light. They could be tucked away in an attic in London. We'll see. But this is the first one, the township of Angaston, as it was in 1844, and otherwise known as German Pass. And here, as in many of Angus's works, he quickly realised that the best time of day to make an image like this was around dusk, just as the sky was getting a bit of colour in it, but there was still enough detail in the landscape. So the next one. And then this is a rather interesting one, because the one on the left, they're both of the Lindock Valley, and the one on the left was plate 2 in the description of the Barossa range. And you probably, from your distance, won't be able to pick the difference between the two, apart from the general. The shepherd is obviously different. There are other small differences, but the key difference for me is in the midground of the one on the left, there's a mine. And it was a copper mine. There were 2 copper mines found in the Lindock Valley. One was on the South Australia Company land, but the other was on Angus's land. And I believe this was prompted by the discovery of copper on Angus's land, which was also in the Lindock Valley. And the one on the right is the image from South Australia Illustrated, published in 1847. But Angus by that time was back in England. And when the time came for the description of the Barossa range to be published, he added a mine to his own pre-existing image. So that's why you see it there, even though he probably had no clear idea where that mine was. So that's interesting. Next one. Now this is the headquarters, John Howard Angus's Tarrawonga. I understand that when he first arrived and went up there, he actually slept in a box. And that wasn't apparently uncommon. You could get such a device or have one made, and people would do that. It was just the minimum that you needed, and you would be protected against the elements and possibly dingoes or whatever else. Then he, after a few weeks, he engaged somebody to build him a little hut, and that's it. And it's still there in Tarrawonga, although it was greatly expanded. And near Tarrawonga, which is just down the road from Colin Grove, the Angus seat, as it's known, there was also a village that was constructed largely under the direction of John Howard and George French's brother-in-law, Henry Evans, who set up at Evandale, which is on the Eden Valley side, and that property is also still in the Angus or the Evans family. So that, the river there is the Gawler or the North Parra River. And this was really the centre of John Howard Angus's operations. The next one. Salem Valley, which was the name given to that valley that runs through from Anguston to the Eden Valley. In the text for this, Angus mentions those Aboriginal people who are sort of on the road, and says that they were on their way to Murundi, which was this station run by Edward Eyre on the Murray. And so it gives us an idea that there was a road which has since disappeared from the outlet to the Mallee, from the Barossa to Murundi, which was not quite due east. It was a little bit to the north. Right, next one. And this will be of interest to at least one or two people here, I know, because it's Angus's view of sheep shearing in the Barossa. And we know that German women were very adept at shearing sheep, and were known for that, and made a living from joining the shearing gangs. But it's very hard to tell through. I mean, if we had access to the original of these images, because these are the lithographs, we might be able to pick out a female form under that tent, or under that canvas. But we don't know, and we don't know exactly where that. It just says sheep shearing in the Barossa, so we're not quite sure where that was. But once again, John Howard Angus's diary fills in some missing elements, and he actually describes engaging women as shearers. Not only that, he talks about how they shore the sheep, and he was astonished at how he says they were very gentle with the sheep. And I can imagine the contrast between, the men sort of throwing the sheep around and nicking them here and there, and the blood on the floor and so on. But apparently these women treated the sheep most tenderly. That's a little bit of interesting trivia. And the last one in that series, is the next slide, is really what precipitated the, or why it was that Angus held off sending the images back until the very end of February. And this was that George Fife had arranged almost as a first task for his son to build a chapel, which is still standing in Angaston and is the oldest building in the Barossa. And it was opened on the 28th of February 1844, and George French has drawn or has made that view of the chapel from a little bit above where the main street runs through Angaston today, looking up towards Penrice Road. And the figures in the scene are all, well, there'd be Sarah, Angus's sister, and Henry Evans, and others known to the family and other worthies of the district. And as soon as that image was done, the following morning, George French rode his horse back to Adelaide to deliver the images to the ship, which was actually then delayed for a week. But that was that's what they were waiting for. They were waiting for that significant gesture, I suppose, in terms of imprinting the Dissent sort of moniker on the landscape in South Australia. The freedom of religion, which George Fife had seen as absolutely crucial to South Australia: freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, non-exclusive religious access, and of course no convicts, and all of these other aspects which we've somehow woven into the fabric of our society. This was largely due to the dissenters who were coming and planning South Australia. Next one. So that's the final image, and you might not be able to see it so clearly, but it's the progression of Angas through his life. On the top left, we see that rather almost effete figure of the young man who looks as though he's just graduated from Tavistock Grammar School, possibly. And then on the bottom there, Angas in 1848, that was the one I began with. So you can see already the boy becomes a man, I suppose, in those two images. And then his life unfolded, and that's not something I'm going to go into now, but he, after South Australia and New Zealand and New South Wales, he went back to England. He then published and had his exhibition in the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. It was all successful. His subscribers got their copies of South Australia Illustrated. And then he set off for South Africa and did the same thing. Made a number of images, beautiful images. We hold them, most of them in South Australia, in Adelaide, in the museum and the Royal Geographical Society. He returned and had an exhibition and published a volume called The Kaffirs Illustrated. And that's a very rare volume. And then in 1849, he was appointed as a naturalist, and this must have been for him the payback for all that work, because he did an enormous amount in just 2 or 3 years, hundreds and hundreds of finely executed watercolours and sketches. We haven't even seen all of them. they'll come to light here and there over the years, I imagine. But he was appointed to the sort of Persian border survey that was being run by the British government, and the British Museum had an interest in that. So they went along, and any relics and archaeological objects that were of interest were collected and taken back to the British Museum. That was going to be George French Angas's role to participate in that, but also to look at the natural history along the way. However, once he got to Turkey, because it was the Turco-Persian border, he fell ill with a fever and had to be invalided out, and so that really was the end of that magnificent opportunity that he'd had. So he came back to London, and then mysteriously, no one in the family could work it out. He married an Irish girl from Dublin. And that became one of the big stumbling blocks for me in writing the book about Angas, because I just couldn't work it out either. And I knew her name, her maiden name was Alicia Moran. And then I thought to myself, well, one of his assistants, or his assistant in South Africa, a boy of about 15, who accompanied him as a servant and carrying his easel and boxes, collecting boxes, was named Stephen Moran. And so I thought, well, that's just a coincidence, and Moran is not an uncommon name. But I thought I'll just do what I can and find out about Stephen Moran. And he'd been a cabin boy aboard the ship that Angas took to South Africa. And so I was able to look him up in the Merchant Navy records. And this boy, it turned out, also came from Dublin. And he came from the same house as Alicia Moran. He was her brother. So what had happened was that he'd accompanied Angas to South Africa, and then had come back with him across the sea until one day a storm came up, and when that happened, the cabin boy was the first one to be sent up the mast for reefing in the sails. And he'd drowned. I knew that, and then I knew that he'd married the sister. So it makes sense to me that he took the boy's sea chest, or his belongings, back to Dublin, which he'd never visited before, and met the family, and met Alicia, and they were married a year later. So that was a very satisfactory resolution of that particular historical problem. Having married Alicia, they came out again to Adelaide in 1850. He set up as a drawing teacher in Adelaide. He didn't get much custom. He was on South Terrace, and he applied for the job as a drawing master at St. Peter's College, which had just been established, and he didn't get that. So then gold was discovered in Bathurst, or near Bathurst, and he walked across the Blue Mountains. He took the ship to Sydney and then walked across the Blue Mountains to Bathurst and produced the first published images of the Australian gold rush that were published as lithographs in London. From there, he brought the family, because by then he had at least 2 daughters, and he would eventually have 4. He and Alicia set up in Sydney, and he did a lot of, you could call it jobbing work, sort of contract work, painting rich people's houses, and various other scenes for almanacs and calendars and even music covers, sheet music illustrations. And then in 1853, a job came up at the Australian Museum, and he became the secretary of the Australian Museum, which was really, they didn't use the term director in those days, but he was effectively the director. And he held that position for 7 years, and it was during that period that he really shifted from art to natural history, particularly shell collecting. And he built up the collections of the museum, but also his own shell collecting continued. And then in 1860, he lost the job at the Australian Museum, came over to South Australia and was appointed as the chair of the District Council of Angaston. Yeah. And had that job for a couple of years. Didn't get on with his father, never had, and that wasn't going to change. And they had a falling out. I won't go into the details. And his father effectively said to him, as he had that authority, you and your family are going back to England for good. And that's what happened. He went back to England and set himself up as I suppose, a gentleman naturalist. He joined the Linnaean Society and various other societies and became a world expert on shells of the Southern Hemisphere. A lot of correspondence with other shell collectors, and so the different phases of his career are quite extraordinary. He had really broken his health, I think, by this incredible exertion, particularly the journey through New Zealand in 1844-45. Just this, well, they all had it. John Howard, George Fife and George French worked themselves periodically into a state where they would just collapse and took some time to recover and then went at it again. But George French died at the age of 64 in 1886. And that really brings the story to a close. It probably went a little over time, but thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure that people have got questions here and you may like to answer questions. Okay, now, if I can sort of get a microphone to you, then we can record things.
Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. The wife in Dublin, was she a Roman Catholic or a dissenter?
Yeah, well, that's an important point, and I overlooked mentioning that. She was Catholic, and his father was absolutely appalled. For that generation and for George Fife himself, I think he used the phrase more than once in letters to George French, or to others anyway, the phrase, the mark of Satan. On the forehead, you know, and there is still a family belief that a lot of George French material, he was sort of written out of the script after that. He was alienated from the family. It wasn't quite like that. I mean, she came out with him and she lived in the family residence at Angaston, and the family seemed to get on well with her, and even George Fife seemed to get on quite well with her. But George French was never elevated beyond the status that he had at that time. He received an allowance of £400 a year, which was a very good middle-class salary. But when you think of the estates that his brother had and the inheritance that he received on George Five's death, clearly I think the Catholic element was at work there. Mm.
Okay. I'll get to you, Ken.
Thank you, Philip, for a great talk. As a member of the Field Naturalist Society, I'm really interested in his naturalist side, and I'm wondering what your impression is of the accuracy of the flora and fauna he painted. I'm thinking of other artists of a similar time, and also in particular the Tulack wallaby, which is very unusual. I'm particularly interested in the mammals. Thank you.
Yes, the Tulack wallaby was the wallaby that lived not only on the Coorong Peninsula, it also lived in Western Victoria, as I understand. But it lasted the longest on the Coorong and was extinct, I think, by about the mid-30s. Yeah. Actually, George Gray had first located it or first recognised it as a distinct species the year before, I think in 1843, but he'd never been able to get a good skin and certainly didn't have the measurements and the image, and this is what George French was able to provide on that, on two of the trips, the one to the lower lakes and then the one down the Coorong. So yeah, that was, and of course it was, its initial name was Halmaturus greyi, so he named it for Gray, and the skin was sent to the British Museum. The other, I mean, a number of other natural history records. The Australian sea lion down there at Beachport. That was at that time, that was the westernmost record of that species and remained the westernmost record for a long time. So that was quite important. His other work, the Lepidoptera and the entomological work, the beetles, certainly very accurate, I think. I mean, I haven't spoken to specialists about that, but they're referred to, and certainly his, funnily enough, he not only didn't draw shells on that in that period, but even in later life, he didn't. He described them minutely, but the actual drawings were done by someone else. And I've been wanting to know what the convention was, and what, you know, was it something that you shouldn't do because you could be influenced by your own impression, and it's best to have a third party do the picture. I don't know. There must be a convention, but yeah, there's a lot to talk about with his natural history. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I know time is marching on, but I must hand you over to Ken Zemler from Lyndoch. Lyndoch's getting a bit of a mention here tonight.
Look, thank you so very much indeed for putting pieces of the fascinating jigsaw puzzle together. What I'm very interested in is, was any record of a meeting between our friend George French and Colonel William Light, because we're greatly blessed through Light's sketching, not only his record keeping, and indeed, of course, he worked, he was served under General Graham in the Peninsular Wars, strangely enough, the French fighting the English and vice versa. and in the Battle of Barossa. And hence we had light trundling down in December 1837, and he named it Lyndoch Vale because General Graham had elevated the peerage, Lord Lyndoch, and also Barossa Ranges, not a valley, and I believe it was a cartographer's mistake that we've known it as Barossa ever since. In other words, rather than having the R's and the S's swapped around. And just closing I know where one of the copper mines was because it's just on the hill behind my vineyard. Section 510 of Barossa, if people wish to look it up. And an historian, Jeff Randall, is writing books on the mines, particularly Mengi and so forth, in the Barossa area. But back to that, just any link that you know of between Colonel Light and our dear friend George French?
Short answer to that, and that is no. I'm afraid. Susan, you'll know when Colonel Light died. Yeah, so he died in 1839. Yeah, so there really wasn't a chance. I mean, no. Secondhand, I think he would have had a lot of respect for Light and Gawler especially. So secondhand, I think there would have been an acknowledgement of Light's role, but Angus didn't elaborate on that that we know of. The mine in and Angus actually uses Lyndoch as his spelling. Yeah, so he's faithful to that, which might indicate that he had sympathy for Light. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, time is marching on. Perhaps we'll have one more question here. Was it Peter? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just had a question with regards to the paintings depicting essentially bare hills, and I wonder whether this had anything to do with the direct competition of America, where you had hugely wooded areas that you had to clear, being something that was depicted in generality so that it made it more conducive to pioneers coming over and not knowing that they wouldn't have to clear great tracts of land. There's all this grassland showing.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So one of the very first overlanders to come across from Sydney with cattle was Charles Bonney, and his journal tells us that when he got within sight of, and he was coming, more or less from not Marundi, but that general locality, he reached the northwest bend, that's Morgan, and then he went downstream to near Blanchetown, around there, and then came across. And he comments on this specifically. He says, those hills are bare, absolutely bare. And, there is South Australians, they tend to feel guilty for too much clearing, I think, and I know that there's that sort of current, and so the assumption is that, oh no, the early settlers must have cleared all that land, but no, I think that outer range was bare, but then you go over to the next range, and that was wooded. But even so, I can't remember whether it was George French Angas or someone else writing at that time saying, the extraordinary thing is you do not have to clear anything. You don't have to cut down a single tree. It's already like an English park. Yeah, and I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you, time is marching on, and you can hear the rain out there. We all have to get home yet tonight. So we still have an opportunity to get together informally over supper, and if you could speak to our guest speaker tonight, who's certainly very knowledgeable on the topic that we had without any notes. And I'll call on Dr. Greg Lockwood to come forward and move a vote of thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff and Philip. It's really lovely to have you here this evening, and I'm reminded when the FoLA committee asked me to respond to your address, I guess they weren't well informed about my own career in the graphic arts. In my first year at Horsham High School, I was 11 years old. Among my 10 subjects were watercolour painting and clay modelling. My forte was obviously clay modelling. One day I was lining up to show my creation to the teacher, and the poor piece collapsed in my hands, and the teacher awarded me 2 out of 10. But so I can only admire the work that people like you have done. George French, I've had the pleasure of buying the book during the time of the exhibition last year, and your work too as senior curator, and I'm very thankful for how helpful you've been to me personally, and the work that the Lutheran Archives have been doing for quite a long time, and Lois in particular has been keenly involved preparing Sherman's diary for, God willing, publication one day, and your constant encouragement there. And so I can certainly heartily recommend the book. I've been rereading it this week and just lapping it up, and I look forward to your signing my copy. Many thanks for coming this evening.
Well, I think two copies of the book are already spoken for, but I've got another 2 if anyone's interested for the cut price of $50.
I think if you would have brought 50 along tonight, you would have sold them. And it was suggested to me probably more than a year ago that we should engage you as a guest speaker at a FoLA meeting, and I think it's certainly been very well worthwhile, and it's amazing what research you've dug up, and your book, I think, portrays very well what you've been able to discover, you might say, and hopefully there'll be more copies of your book available if people want to get one. So that is the book, isn't it? Yes. So it's a pretty solid tome. It's ordinary 65, and tonight he's offering it to us for 50. And I'm sure we can take orders. Can you take orders tonight? Take orders tonight somehow or other. So if anybody else wants one, we might be able to arrange to have a running list of purchases. So thank you all so much for coming here tonight. Considering the weather, we had no idea how many people might turn up. And with all the hands that showed for people who took particular interest in this from the History Month perspective, promoting this meeting was certainly very heartening to our committee. And so I'd invite you all to stay for supper in the adjoining room over here, and spend time socially together, and also spend time with our guest speaker. So safe travelling home, and see you next month if you want to come. Thank you.